What do you want? I
just want Google Maps.
Don't go on it. Quiet.
Can they see? 5.2. Okay.
Remember nothing else.
الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ثم أما بعد اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا وأنت خير الراحمين ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين اللهم نسألك رضاك والجنة ونعوذ بك من سخطك والنار اللهم إنك عفو كريم تحب العفو فاعف عنا وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. So we're going to pick up inshallah from last time we left, and I think we had started to cover the Battle of Uhud. I can't remember where we stopped in Uhud, but Uhud in general, just so that when you come to study Uhud, you can break it down roughly into 3 phases. You can break it down into 3 phases. Phase 1 is when the Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ get the news in Medina that the army of Mecca is approaching and they have to start their own preparation. And people join, some people, we'll find out later come back, like Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul and his detachment. They are the hypocrites that come back. So phase 1 is the preparation for the battle, showing up in Uhud, and how the Prophet ﷺ prepares the army and the military strategy that he prepares for the battle and the advice that he gives to the companions. That's phase 1. Phase 2 of Uhud is the start of the battle and the initial victory of the Muslims. So the Muslims literally smash through the enemy lines. They destroy the flag bearers one after the other. New heroes now show up from Islam, and they're on the front line of wiping out, completely demolishing the army of the Quraysh. So much so that they get to the camps of the Quraysh army, and the women that came with the Quraysh army start to flee. You know, one of the companions, I think I may have said this last time, he says, we saw the ankles of the Quraysh women. We caught up to the Quraysh women fleeing, meaning the men were so afraid they took off. The women then turned around and took off. The women were there for the encouragement of the men. The men brought their riches with them to make sure that they would stay and they would fight. This was part of their tradition. And the Muslims actually catch up, and they see the backs of the ankles of the Quraysh women as they lifted up their skirts, including Hind, radiallahu anha, which later on becomes a Muslim, including Hind as she is chasing after her husband, Abu Sufyan, in the battle. Part 3 then of the battle is Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid seeing with a clear military strategy, he was not able to engage in the battle. And part 3 is when things turn for the Muslims because they run after the bounty of war that the Quraysh had left. And we said that this was considered money to them. It was considered very precious things to take over the weapons of the Quraysh army. So part 3 now is the Muslims starting to, confusion in the battle lines. The Khalid ibn Walid and the cavalry come in from behind them. They have to turn around and face them. And then it's the assault on the Prophet ﷺ. So part 3, you can say, is part 3A, 3B. 3A is the confusion and the line destruction of the Muslim army. 70 Sahaba became a shaheed in that day. And then the Quraysh turn around and they go directly after the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ is very lightly protected. You'll see, literally, companions would come up, protect his body, take a bunch of arrows in their back as he's backing up into Uhud. they would pass away. A woman companion would come up to defend the Prophet ﷺ. She gets killed, her son gets killed, and the Prophet ﷺ eventually backs up into a crevice in the mountain of Uhud. We'll see if Google Maps can pick it up for us right now. So we learned that the Prophet ﷺ got the news. He packs up the army on a Friday. He moves to Uhud. The distance, by the way, between the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ and Uhud, so what you're looking at here is literally the scene of the battle. And this pointer, I don't know if you can see the red pointer from where you are. The pointer is Jabal al-Rumah, what is known today as Jabal al-Rumah. It was probably 5 to 7 times this size at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And remember I explained why that was and why that is? Does anyone remember what I said? Why was Jabal al-Rumah much bigger, much taller? Has anyone been to Medina? Has anyone been to Medina? Okay, so when you go to Medina and you go on a tour of Medina, I don't know if you guys can see this area here. See these things? What are these things right here? Buses. Okay, good. So we have a good satellite reconnaissance person. So these are the buses from the satellite. So all the tourists, not the tourists, inshallah, the Hajjaj and the Mu'tamireen that go, that's where they park, and they typically come outside. They take all the pictures. You know, some of them run up and they go to this. This is where we go when we're on the tour. And then this is Jabal al-Rumah. Why was it bigger? It's bigger because every time you and I go and we step on the mountain and we take selfies or Instagram posts or whatever, we come back with some of that mountain with us back to Seattle. So the mountain shrinks over time, and that's why it's the size that it is now. But by most accounts, it was much higher at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and this is where he positions the archers. This was a brilliant strategic move from the Prophet ﷺ. Why is that? They can? They can easily see the enemy. Why else? What's the other reasons?
They fire the arrows.
Okay, they fire the arrows. That's their job. So no bonus points for firing the arrows.
Anyone tries to break in or comes in.
Anyone to try to break in, they stop. Yes. Anyone else? Higher elevation, so that gives you a military advantage. Say that again.
Kudos army was in their reach.
The enemy was in the reach. Yeah. The biggest advantage, all of this is correct. The biggest advantage that the arrows gave the Muslims, because the Quraysh had a weapon that the Muslims didn't have. What did the Quraysh have? Horses. The Quraysh had 2 massive cavalry fleets, one that was led on the right by Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu. By the way, this is when he becomes an actual military star and genius. It hadn't happened before. So even, he was a young man, he was in his 20s, even though he participated in battle, this was the first time you could say he was actually in command. You know, this is when he becomes a star. And on the left flank of the cavalry was Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl. The son of Abu Jahl himself was leading the left side of the flank of the cavalry, and both of them were best friends, right? Both of them eventually accept Islam. You know, I think we have covered that, but very quickly, Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu accepts Islam right before Fath Makkah, and Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl accepts Islam immediately after Fath Makkah. He is so afraid of the Prophet ﷺ that he takes his family, he leaves Mecca, he escapes to the ocean, and the Prophet ﷺ sends Khalid ibn Walid, his best friend, after him, and he says, come back. The Prophet ﷺ welcomes you, to Islam, and he says, really? Like, he's not going to kill me after everything my father did? And he says, no. And Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, if you remember, I said, what was his biggest contribution after he became a Muslim? His armies reached north of modern-day Iran. So, the area northeast of Iran, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all the way up to Afghanistan, all these lands were liberated actually by Sayyidina Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl. Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid's scope was actually more what you would call the Arabian Peninsula, right? All of Iraq, which at the time was the Persian Empire, all the way up to Syria, which was the Southern Roman Empire, right? That was where Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu operated. Sayyidina Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, after, he actually was sent by the other Khulafa to go northeast, way past the Persian Empire. Okay, so the Muslim army now marches from Medina. By the way, how far is the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ to this area here? What's the distance? Does anyone know? Today, even in like today's terms. It's 3 kilometers. It's very short, right? It's 3 kilometers. At the time, obviously, they didn't have these roads. The Prophet ﷺ took the back roads. The Quraysh have to go all the way around this area, and the Quraysh camp out roughly over here. This is the Quraysh camp, right? So the Quraysh camp have to go around, and this is where they camp. the Prophet ﷺ camps in this general area. And you can see over here, it says Sayyid al-Shuhada. I don't know if you can see this area right over here. This is where Hamza radiallahu anhu and passes away the graveyard. This is where the Prophet ﷺ backs up into Uhud. And I don't know if we can do this here. It has pictures of places. Doesn't Google bring up pictures of things? Okay, we'll find it some other time, but there's actually a picture I wanted to show you of the actual, it's like a cave or a crevice where the Prophet ﷺ retreated to. So the Muslims are effectively the area that they are, this is the line of battle, right here. The line of battle is no longer than 300, 400 meters, which is from one tip of Uhud to the Jabal al-Rumah. The Rumah are stationed right up on the mountain. There's about 50 of them. The total size of the Muslim army is 700. This is really where they're stationed. The camp of the Prophet ﷺ is back here, and the Quraysh is on this side, and the battle starts. And right at the start of the battle, the Quraysh start to send people to cause a breakup in the lines of the Muslims, right? So, for example, they send a person called Abu Amir al-Rahib. And Abu Amir al-Rahib is whose father from the Muslim side? Abu Amir al-Rahib means what in Arabic? Who is Abu Amir al-Rahib? He is a mushrik from Quraysh. He was originally from Medina. He was allied to Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. When the Prophet ﷺ went, he wanted to be second in command. He didn't stay and become a munafiq. He left and he joined the enemy and he went to Mecca. And his son was Hamdallah radiallahu anhu. His son was Hamdallah, who was called Ghasil al-Malaika, who had just been married the day before. And we'll see how he participates in battle and becomes a shaheed. Abu Amr al-Rahib tells Abu Sufyan, let me go and negotiate. They're my people, meaning the Ansar, because I'm from Medina. They're going to hear me, they respect me. I'm going to tell them to abandon this battle. We don't need to fight with you. We're only after the Muhajirin and these people that are traitors and betrayed us and changed their religion. And they had the audacity to go and fight us in Badr and so on and so forth. And when they go, the Ansar actually curse him. And he turns back to Abu Sufyan and he says, I don't know what happened to my people after I left. Some evil thing has landed on them. The initial mubaraza, and there was multiple of them, but it included Talha ibn Ubaydillah and Ali ibn Abi Talib. So this is where, in Badr also they said, hey, who's the bravest one who's going to come up and fight and so forth. And Sayyidina Talha ibn Ubaydillah was first. Talha ibn Ubaydillah faced the man from the Quraysh. He was one of the most powerful warriors, and he was, I forgot his name now, but they used to call him the Ram. Like, when two teams are playing football and they go, oh, that man's the bomb. Like, he goes through the other team right away and he scores the touchdown. So this guy was known as the Ram. And this Ram gets up and he comes and he challenges Talha ibn Ubaydillah on his camel. And Talha ibn Ubaydillah jumps up, he runs up, he jumps, he drags him down, he pulls him down from the camel and he kills him on the spot. And the Quraysh started like, ooh, that's not good, right? We just had our black belt picked out by someone on their side. The second one that comes up is actually the third cousin of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, and he comes out and they used to badmouth each other, like, you're a brave guy, blah blah blah. Like that's kind of the attitude. And Ali ibn Abi Talib goes out and also he actually cuts off his leg, and in the battle he takes a swipe at the sword that way, cuts off his leg, and he falls. He starts to beg him for his life, and Ali ibn Abi Talib had some sympathy on him and let him go. This man, by the way, later on dies as well in the battle. Abu Sufyan then, the battle's about to start, it's imminent. He goes to Banu Abd al-Dar. More Banu Abd al-Dar, one of the clans of Quraysh that had a specialization. Remember, the clans of Quraysh each had a specialization. We're the ones that bring the water. We're the ones that bring food. We're the ones that have the strongest warriors. Who are the ones that were known for the strongest warriors? Banu Makhzum, Khalid ibn Walid, right? His name was Khalid ibn Walid, and Makhzumi, right? And Makhzum was a tribe known for warriors, right? It doesn't mean that the others won't fight, but these were like the black belts, right? The black belts of the Quraysh. So Banu Abd al-Dar's specialization was the carriers of the flag bearers, which is arguably the most important job in the battle. So Banu Abd al-Dar, Abu Sufyan turns to them and he said, hey, we lost in Badr because of you guys. Are you guys going to stand up and be real men, or are you going to drop the flag like you did last time? He He said, no, we've got it. Don't worry, we've got this. We're never gonna let the flag go, right? And they start to say poetry about how brave they are and how much they're gonna carry the flag and take care of the flag and so forth. When the battle starts, amongst the people that go charging from the Muslims into the lines of the Quraysh include Hamza radiallahu anhu, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Abu Dujana. Abu Dujana has a story in Uhud. I can't remember if we covered this or not. But before the battle starts, so the battle happened between when and when? What times? Time of day? Okay, it's been a long couple of weeks. After the prayer of Fajr and before the prayer of Dhuhr. So it was the morning, right? Like 9 a.m., 10 a.m., it was in the morning, right? So before the battle starts and after the prayer, the Prophet ﷺ came up with his sword and he says, who wants to take my sword and fight with my sword? Who wants to take and fight with my sword? And all of them were like, me, Rasulullah, I'll take it. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, who wants to take and fight with my sword and give it its due right? So all the hands went down. And Abu Dujana asked the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, what is the right of the sword, Ya Rasulullah? And the Prophet ﷺ says that you fight with it and until it's smashed to bits. You fight as hard as you can until the sword is smashed to little bits and pieces. You know, speaking about Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid, one of the most famous things you'll read about him in his biographies that have been written about him in books of Seerah, when the first time he fought with Muslims was which battle? No, on the Muslim side. He was not in Badr at all. Sayyidina Khalid did not participate in Badr. Mu'tah. The first time Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid participated on the Muslim side, actually as a regular fighter and not a leader, he became a leader automatically, but he wasn't a leader to start off with, was in the Battle of Mu'tah. Mu'tah is in Jordan, modern day Jordan, and the Prophet ﷺ sent an army to fight against the Husasina, who were effectively the Arab agents of the Romans. That the Romans now were starting to feel insecure, so they're going to test these Muslims out to see if they're actually worth anything. But it's not worth sending our modern army. Let's just send these guys in. And Sayyidina Khalid, when he fought, he through the killing of the first two leaders, they appointed him as the third. The Muslims actually got together and they said, we're going to appoint you as the leader on us. And it is said that in the third day of battle, he wrecked 31 swords in his hands. 31 of them. Like he'd go and fight, smash the bits, go get the second one, and so on and so forth, until he destroyed 31 of them. So this was a sign of courage and bravery. Why did the swords break? Like we have this idea, like swords don't. Okay, so people. Okay. Any other reasons? Hitting the shields, yeah. You have armored men, and you have shields, and you have other swords, and you have spears. Like no matter the quality, that's why if you and it's funny because I have a sword story now that just happened over the holidays. But alhamdulillah, for whatever reason, I didn't get one. But I was actually in a city that was known for sword construction. The city specialization. This is a city in Spain. The Arabic name of it is Tulaytila. And Tulaytila, the Arabs had actually taught the Europeans how to manufacture amazing swords. And the sword that they used to use in Andalusia in Spain is still there as a model. So it's this amazing short scimitar like this, and on it is inscribed La Ghaliba illallah. You see this all throughout the message. I didn't know this, but this was their motto. She's the only one that gives victories Allah, right? And then I had a problem, and the problem was how was I going to carry it back? It'd be pretty funny. What's that? Oh, it's my sword. But anyway, so this is swords of quality are the ones that are perfect in armor, perfect in the type of composition of the armor that they had. By the way, the Arabs were not as good at it at the time of the Prophet ﷺ as the Yahudis. The Yahudis had specialization in weapon construction, right? Okay, so Abu Dujana is the one that takes the sword of the Prophet ﷺ. And Abdullah ibn Zubayr Zubayr ibn Awam felt something in his heart. He actually narrates this in relation to Uhud in one of the hadith of Uhud. He said, I felt something in my heart that Abu Dujana is the one that took the sword. Meaning, I was really upset because he's related to the Prophet ﷺ, right? And Abu Dujana is not, right? Like, why did he get it? I'm the one that's more entitled to the sword. So he narrates about Uhud. I followed him, like, he's seeing them. Obviously, this is man-to-man combat, not satellite space things like we have nowadays. So he says, I followed him in the battlefield to see how he was going to do. And he said he was really worthy of the sword. He was like, Abu Dujana went in and just like wiped out, these mushriks, one after the other. There's a debate in the books of Sirah of who killed more of the mushriks. Was it Hamza radiallahu anhu, who was said that he killed how many people on that day? Does anyone know? 30 to 31, 32 people. Hamza alone, radiallahu anhu, right? Versus Abu Dujana, who also had like a major, contribution on that day. But he says he was basically wiping them out one after the other. There was one man in particular, very strong from the Quraysh side, that was wounding the Muslims, and Abu Dujana found him and went after him and finished him off. And then there was another person that was dressed in armor that was encouraging the mushrikeen to keep attacking. And now this is a hadith narrated by Abu Dujana. He says, I went to that person, I tripped them, I tripped them and they fell, and I was about to hit them with my sword, and I found that it was a woman. So I didn't want to, dishonor the sword of the Prophet ﷺ by using it to kill a woman, right? I didn't want to dishonor the sword of the Prophet ﷺ, so I let her go. And who was this, by the way? Hind, right? Hind was the one that was actually, she had a major role in leading the cheerleaders of the Quraysh. And I didn't bring it, but like I have books that have the poetry that the women would recite. The mushrik women would recite to the mushrik men as they go to battle. And incidentally, so if you think of how this is occurring, the two sides are clashing. These mushrik men are in the back, and they have drum, and they have these dufuf, these drums, and they're banging on the drums as the battle's going on, and they're singing, and they're also reading these anashid as the men are fighting. If the men retreat, then they say, "You're a coward. Go back and fight like a man." This and this and that. That was the role of the mushrik women. That was the role of the mushrik women, right? By the accounts of Ibn Ishaq, who's one of the authoritative writers of Sirah, Hamza radiallahu anhu inflicted the most damage on Quraysh of that day. Zubayr ibn Awam, by the way, got a title on that day, which is he's the disciple of the Prophet ﷺ. His father was killed in Uhud accidentally. So this happens in actually phase 3 of the battle. The father of Zubayr ibn Awam, as the Muslims are retreating, so now they see the enemy coming from the back as they're picking up the bounty on the ground. They now have to drop this bounty and turn around and face off against the cavalry or the infantrymen coming after them, and they clash with them head on. Well, some of the ones in the back were actually Muslim, and one of them was the father of Zubayr ibn Awam. The father of Zubayr ibn Awam happened to be dressed in armor, and he was an old man. And he knew that was his father, and he could see him from a distance, and he starts to yell at the Muslims to, leave him, he's my father, but he is killed, what we would call today by friendly fire. And the Prophet ﷺ, after Uhud, commands the Muslims to pay the diya of the father of Zubayr ibn Awam from Baytul Mal al-Muslimin, which was worth 100 camels. Okay, we really need to go back, review this. 100 camels was a huge amount of money. So the Prophet ﷺ pays the diya of the father from the Baytul Mal to Zubayr ibn Awam. And Zubayr ibn Awam, by the way, he has a beautiful hadith on that day, where he says, غَفَرَ اللَّهُ لَنَا وَلَكُمْ, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive you and forgive us for what you've done, knowing it was an accident. And he takes this money and he feeds it back to the Bayt al-Mal. Like he took it and then he gave it back. And the companions narrate about Zubayr ibn Awam that they say he never lived a better life than he ever lived, except after he made that move. In other words, he took the diya for the father and he gave it right back, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevated him in status. Khalid ibn Walid now we're going to move to first phase. The Muslims smash through the mushriks and they're at their camps and they start to collect the money. Like there's tents and they walk out, and if you're sitting on the mountain and you're one of the archers, you're looking at them and you're going like, that man just walked out with $1,000. That man just walked out with $2,000. That man's got gold in his pocket. Look at that backpack, it's full of silver. Look at this guy, he's got 3 spears. So they're seeing this from the top of the mountain, and they're like, it's our turn. The battle's finished. We've won. It's done. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says before the battle, and he emphasizes to them, he says, don't ever leave until I call for you. And he says, don't leave whether you see us winning or losing. Another hadith, he says, don't leave even if you see the crows eating at our bodies. Don't leave. Don't leave your positions. So now they start to have this debate. By the way, this wasn't like, just also for us to understand, It wasn't like they just decided to get up and go. You understand? Like there was a debate up on top of the mountain with their leader, right? And the leader's name is Abdullah ibn Jubayr. So they're like, hey, the battle's over. We should go as well. We should take our turn. Look at the stuff that they're getting. And he said, no, the Prophet ﷺ said to wait until we give instructions. Then they wait a little bit more, and then they go out again. And then the voices start to increase about, it's finished. The Quraysh are retreating. Look at where they are. You know, the cavalry's not attacking. We're good to go. And they decide to leave him. By the way, there was 3 other companions that stood on the side of the leader, and they said, you should obey what he's telling you, because he's the one that the Prophet ﷺ put in command. But effectively, in their minds, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive them all, this isn't blaming anyone, because the companions of Allah are the best of generations, right? But they decide to go, and they leave, and they go after the bounty. So when they descend, they effectively leave 10 people with a Jubayr. Jubayr ibn Abdullah now has 10 people. He had 50, he now has 10. And the one that notices, as he's retreating, so Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, by the way, is one of the only people that's retreating with the mushrik cavalry, but he's keeping it together. It's not a disorganized retreat like the infantry ones. The infantry gets smashed to bits, and this is a completely disorganized retreat. Every man for his life. I don't care what anyone else is doing. No one's listening to any orders or commands or anything. But Khalid ibn Walid is keeping it together, and he looks and he's like, wait a minute, they're starting to come down, stop. So he stops, turn around, they turn around, he observes, okay, there's 10 of them left, it's time for us to counterattack. And if you remember on this map, just to go back and remind you, he did not go around the mountain of Uhud. So this is this area, all of this is the mountain of Uhud. You know, this what you hear a lot in books is of history or seerah. He went all the way around the mountain and he surprised them from here. He did not do that. Okay, so just to be clear, that was anyone. When you read these in books, it typically indicates that they have never been to Medina, because it would have taken him literally 4 hours to go around the mountain with cavalry. You understand? Khalid ibn Walid, instead, what he did was, by most accounts, and this is just not my opinion of many other people as well, is he was somewhere over here, and he retreats and he goes back up this way, up the mountain of the archers. So he does a U-turn, and he does a wide arc, and he comes up from behind the mountain of the archers. They start to fire. The 10 that are left with Jubayr ibn Abdullah start to fire the archers, so much so that he finishes his ammunition and he pulls out his sword, but eventually they're all martyred, and none of them are left to defend the flank of the Muslims, who are all down here now in this area collecting the bounty, and their backs are towards the cavalry of Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid. So he now goes down and he descends, and they're cavalrymen with swords. If you've ever seen cavalrymen attack, infantrymen, they're swinging one or more swords, and it's just like a machine. Like they're coming down. This is like a tank compared to an infantryman. These horses that they had, especially if the horses had armor on them, they're indestructible practically, right? Like they're completely armored. They're moving at a high rate of speed, and they have spears or they have swords. And an infantryman is just very easy to kill. And so they're now coming from behind, and the Prophet ﷺ sees them, and the Prophet ﷺ actually calls for them. And he says, Ilayya ibadallah. And they all, now he's calling attention to the fact that they're being attacked from behind, because he's observing what's happening from his vantage point over here. This had the disadvantage of giving away his position, but it shows the bravery of the Prophet ﷺ that he didn't want them to die either. He wanted to save the Muslim army, right? He wanted to save the Muslim army. So he calls to them, and they turn around, and then they see Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid, and then the disarray starts to happen in the Muslim army. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comments about this, or speaks about this in Surah Al-Imran, and he says, obviously right about Uhud, حتى إذا فشلتم وتنازعتم في الأمر وعصيتم بعد ما أراكم ما تحبون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you were victorious until you argued and you disobeyed, and you saw what you really loved in your hearts, meaning the gold and the treasure and the bounty, versus the obedience of Allah and His Messenger, right? And so in the retreat, as I said, the father of Hudayfa ibn Yaman becomes a shaheed. Now we're going to talk about Sayyidina Hamza. Sayyidina Hamza, on most accounts, he becomes a shaheed as they are victorious, not before Khalid ibn Walid goes and attacks the mountain. So he actually becomes a shaheed in part 1 of the battle. When the Quraysh are retreating, Wahshi is there. Wahshi is there for the single purpose of assassinating Sayyidina Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib. Wahshi radiallahu anhu, who accepts Islam later, actually says, I had no interest in politics, I had no interest in the battle, I had no interest in who's right and who's wrong, but they basically promised me my freedom if I were to go and I were to kill Hamza radiallahu anhu. So he actually says, and by the way, he narrates a lot of these stories as he's much older. By most accounts, he's blind, and he's now narrating these stories to other younger companions or the generation after the companions, and he lives in Iraq. And he says to them, I went and I hid behind a tree, and the only person I was looking for was Sayyidina Hamza radiallahu anhu, and I could see him wiping out the men one at a time, and every time I saw him do it with the strength that he did, my heart would shake in fear. My number one concern was to stay hidden. His number one concern is he didn't want him to see me because he'd be finished off right away. And he basically says, I followed him until I saw an opportunity where he turned around and he was about to attack someone, and he raises his sword, and now the shield on his back exposes a part of his back. So he had shields on the front and shields on the back, covering him. And now he sees a little, spot, if you like, soft spot in the back where he could throw his spear. And he was an expert spear thrower where he throws his spear and he kills Sayyidina Hamza radiallahu anhu. He says he made a sound like, if someone gets I don't know what the name is in English, but if the air gets knocked out of you, you get punched really hard and someone just goes like that. That's the sound that Sayyidina Hamza radiallahu anhu made. And he turned around and he saw me and he took 2 steps towards me. And at that time I thought if he got to me, I'd be dead. But he collapsed and fell and he became a shaheed before he actually found me, before he reached me. So this is the shahada of Hamza radiallahu anhu. And he later on says that he escapes. He went back to Mecca. And when the Muslims were coming to Mecca, he was terrified and he left Mecca and he went to Al-Ta'if. And the Muslims went to Al-Ta'if. Afterwards, he became terrified and he left and he went to Syria. And he ran into companions and they told him, listen, the Prophet ﷺ will never kill or take revenge on you if you take the Shahada. So he covers himself up head to toe like an Arab Bedouin. And he goes to Medina to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ doesn't know who he is. And he basically takes off the cover of his head and he takes the Shahada right in front of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet asks him if he's Wahshi, and he says yes. And the Prophet ﷺ starts to tear up and he says, tell me how you killed Hamza radiallahu anhu. And he goes through the detail. And the Prophet ﷺ says, let me not ever see your face. So the Prophet ﷺ didn't take revenge on him. He didn't hurt him, but he just said, it causes me too much pain, this particular memory of the killing of my uncle. And so I don't want to. So Wahshi radiallahu anhu, he says, whenever, even a prayer, I would stand behind the pillar or stand behind the companion, such that I don't upset the Prophet ﷺ based on what he said. Wahshi radiallahu anhu, later on, he says, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, in order for me to redeem myself, this was at the time of the Irtidad and Musaylim al-Kadhab, who showed up at the time of the Khilafah of Sayyidina who? Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He says, I decided to go and fight in whose army? Against Musaylimah. Who was the leader of the army? Very easy. Khalid ibn Walid. Khalid ibn Walid was the leader of the army. He says, I volunteered to go after Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid, and I took the same javelin, the same spear that I used to kill Hamza, with the intent of going to kill Musaylim al-Kadhab, and he kills Musaylim al-Kadhab with the same spear. And he says, he is hopeful that Allah would forgive this with that. What is our perspective as Muslims on that? It's not a trick question.
When he accepts Islam,
when he accepts Islam, everything is forgiven. But you could see that the weight still was heavy over his shoulder, especially with how hurt he felt he made the Prophet ﷺ. Right? So he's still carrying that as a burden. So Sayyidina Wahshi radiallahu anhu is the one that killed Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu. The Prophet ﷺ has a very hadith. Now, we're going to fast forward to the end. I'm not going to do this because next time I'm going to focus on part 3 only, which is what happened with the Prophet ﷺ. I'm going to focus to beyond that. The Prophet ﷺ, as he's inspecting the shuhada at the end of the battle, he sees Hamza radiallahu anhu, and he's extremely pained by what he saw because they effectively mutilate the body. Right? They mutilate the body of Hamza radiallahu anhu. Incidentally, I don't know if anyone is following this, but just drawing an analogy between vicious criminals that mutilate people after they're dead. This Israeli thing in Gaza, one of the videos that came out, I think it was 2 weeks ago, was with one of the resistance fighters destroying one of those Caterpillar, tractors or whatever. And the Caterpillar tractor, this is this fighter saying this and it's recorded, had the job of going out and digging up the Muslim cemetery. Like it was going through a Muslim cemetery, right? The other thing that happened, anyway, I don't want to get too graphic, let's keep going. So now the Prophet ﷺ sees this, he says two things. He says, if it were not for Safiya, I would have left his body there. Who is Safiya? And the aunt of the Prophet ﷺ and the sister of Hamza. She's the direct sister of Hamza. He says, if it were not for hurting her feelings, I would have left his body there to be eaten by the wild beasts and by the birds. Why does the Prophet ﷺ say this? There's more to come in this hadith. Why does he say this? He says, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give him a bigger reward on the Day of Judgment and resurrect him from all these different beasts together as a man. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ, we have this in Islam. If someone, for example, dies by drowning. By the way, a drowning person is a category of shahada. Someone who dies drowning is a category of shahada. Someone that dies under a building collapse, right, or like an earthquake, is also a category of shahada, right? So if someone dies as shaheed by drowning in the ocean, and different fish come and eat them, the Prophet ﷺ says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gathers all these parts that the fish have eaten back into a man on the Day of Judgment. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, meaning there would have been more honor, even more honor for Hamza radiallahu anhu saying that, to have gotten this benefit, but I'm not going to do that for his aunt. And then he says, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, if I catch them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives me victory over them, meaning the mushriks, right? He says this after the battle, I will do this to 30 of them. What they did to Hamza radiallahu anhu, I will do to 30 of the mushriks, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then reveals this ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنْ عَاقَبْتُمْ فَعَاقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا عُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ وَلَئِنْ صَبَرْتُمْ لَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لِلصَّابِرِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore commands us, that if we are to punish anyone, the maximum punishment that you can inflict is the punishment that's been inflicted on you. You can't say one is equivalent to 30, right? And if you forgive, it is even better. It is even better. So the Prophet ﷺ, after this ayah was revealed, he said to the companions, there is no mutilation ever in Islam or desecrating of the dead, obviously including the enemy. So the minimum required of a Muslim is to do what? After the battle? An honorable burial to the enemy. So Islam actually teaches us to even the enemies that have been killed in battle after an army has been victorious or whatever, to show them the honor of a proper burial. Even if it's a simple burial, but give them the proper burial and don't do anything else to the bodies, right? So this also happened as the outcome of that. Okay, I'm going to talk quickly now about some of the, now we're in phase 2. Phase 2 is the destruction of the mushriks. I'm going to talk about some people that had these different kind of situations. And next time we'll talk about what happens with the Prophet ﷺ, which is quite a lot. So Hanzala had just been married. He comes to the battle, and he is very close to killing Abu Sufyan. He is literally an arm's length away with a sword from killing the leader of the Quraysh. So he's participating in that first match that happened against them. Somehow he's able to get to the leader of the Quraysh, and he's killed by an unknown spear. So the unknown spear is the one that kills him. And the Prophet ﷺ says, I saw the angels making ghusl to Hanzala as they were raising him up into heaven, right? As they were raising up into heaven. So when he went to the battle, he was junub, right? He was junub from his marriage. The other thing, the other hadith is about Mus'ab ibn Umayr. He was actually probably killed by the initial attack of Khalid ibn Walid. So as Khalid ibn Walid is going down, Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umayr, who's Mus'ab ibn Umayr? He was the first ambassador of Islam. He was literally the first muhajir to Medina. He was the beloved superstar of Mecca. He was the young, spoiled kid that everyone in Mecca loved. He came from a very rich family, very rich mother, very rich father. He changed clothes all the time, had the best perfume, had the latest fashion. And when he accepted his Islam, they took all of that away from him. They imprisoned him in his house. They chained him up. And we saw the Prophet ﷺ, he said he should make the hijrah to Medina. And when he goes to Medina, he's the one that effectively educates many of the people that later become Ansar at the hands of Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umayr. So he went 2 years before the hijrah to Medina, educating the many Madani tribes on Islam, and many of them accept Islam because of him. He is the flag bearer, and he's attacked by the cavalry of Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid, and they cut off his hand. He grabs it with the other hand, and finally he gets killed. Mus'ab ibn Umayr, as the Prophet ﷺ is burying him, they're crying. They're crying. Why? Because he came from such a rich family, and his clothes could only cover half his body. So they would move it against the legs, it wouldn't cover the top, they move it up to the bottom. And the Prophet ﷺ finally said, use it to cover the top part. Like, if you're wearing your ihram and it goes down to your knees, like do that. And then cover the rest of the body with, the grass of the desert, right? He had nothing even to be buried with, right? There's a hadith, a very long hadith, I'm going to go through the whole hadith, by Sayyidina Khabbab ibn al-Arat. Khabbab ibn al-Arat was also a very early immigrator to Medina, and he witnessed Uhud, and he was in Uhud. And he later on, mashallah, grows through the ranks, and he becomes a governor. So he went from being very poor to very rich. He has his own house, he has a garden, and so forth. And he speaks about this as he's about to die. So he tells his family as he's about to die, he says, Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umayr in Uhud had nothing except for one garment. And he says that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him all his reward in akhirah. But he gave me part of my reward in dunya, and I'm hoping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has saved something for me in akhirah. And look how he's thinking about what he has. Like, I'm hoping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saves something for me from my akhirah. There's another really famous warrior in Uhud, and his name is Quzman. Has anyone heard of this man? Quzman. So Quzman was actually one of the hypocrites that went back with Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. So he is part of the hypocrite team, and he goes back to Medina, and he is shamed by the women. The women are like, you came back, you coward, you coward, you coward. They're all fighting over there. They're fighting bravely, and you came back on your own. And he goes back to participate in the initial Muslim charge, and he does really well. And the companions are reporting back to the Prophet ﷺ. They say, hey, Quzman came back from the group of Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, and he's just wiping out the Quraysh. By the way, he's one of the men that goes into one of the early tents to take out money. He's one of those guys. And the Prophet ﷺ says to them, huwa fin nar. He's going to Jahannam. And they say, and actually, the companions become concerned. They're like, if he's in Jahannam, like how? Like, what about us? Like he came back and he's fighting courageously and bravely. Later on, this Quzman gets wounded with an arrow. Now, his intention, Allah, when coming back, was that he was shamed by the women, not so much because he wanted to really participate, fi sabilillah, right? He gets wounded by an arrow and he can't take the pain of the arrow, so he ends up committing suicide. Obviously, this is not acceptable in Islam, right? So Quzman commits suicide, and he passes away. The Prophet ﷺ has a hadith though about this, and he says, "Inna Allah la yu'ayyidu hadha ad-din bir-rajul al-fajr." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala assists this deen even if it's with an evil man. Like sometimes evil men come in unknowingly, and they actually help the case of this deen with the things that they say are the things, right? Like, you look at this case in South Africa. Like, they're not representing this because of Islam. South Africa and the International, Court of Justice in Holland, like they're doing this out of their sense of justice. That's a good thing, and we should applaud them for it. But you understand that, so anyway, Allah. So there's another man called. This is an amazing man. His name is Amr ibn Thabit al-Usayrim. Amr ibn Thabit al-Usayrim has a really particular, interesting event on the day of Uhud. He is still a pagan in Medina, and he had gone on a trip, and he comes back to Medina and no one's in the city. He's like, where's this person? They're out with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Uhud. Where's this person? He's out with Muhammad. He's like, what am I doing here? So he looks at his family and he says, listen, all my friends are out there. I'm going to take Islam. I'm going to take the Shahada right now in front of you. They're all kuffar. And he says, if I die in this battle, give all my money to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he goes into battle and becomes a shaheed. So he becomes a shaheed in Uhud. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says he is in Jannah. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what does he say about him in particular? You want to see a man that's going to Jannah without prostrating one time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's this man. How come he didn't prostrate? Because it wasn't time to pray. He left after Fajr and he died before Dhuhr. There wasn't an opportunity for him to pray, right? And so, subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ has a hadith about him. He says, عَمِلَ قَلِيلًا وَأَجْرُهُ كَثِيرٌ. He says he did very little worship, like no worship, right? But he has a massive reward with Allah. And subhanAllah, this particular story is very moving. Like I'm saying it quickly, but you think of many of the people, even in this country, subhanAllah, take the shahada on their deathbed, or take the shahada, and this brother took shahada, or they died 2 days later. Like this happens. This kind of thing happens, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills good for someone right at the end of their life. Right at the end of their life, they accept shahada. So, another really fine hadith here. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he says, I used to test. Now, Abu Hurairah was a master. He was a PhD, obviously, in Islam, and he was teaching Islam after the Prophet. So he says, when I wanted to ask my students a trick question, I'd ask them that question: who is the man that went into Jannah without prostrating once to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? And that's the answer that he was looking for, right? Is Amr ibn Thabit al-Musaylim. There's a man that came back with the Yahud, did not participate with the Prophet ﷺ. There was a man called Mukhayriq. There's a dispute about whether or not this Mukhayriq accepted Islam or not. He was from the Yahudis of Medina, and he was saying, shame on you for leaving the Prophet ﷺ the way he is. He goes and he participates in the battle, and he does it out of a sense of duty. And the Prophet ﷺ has a hadith about him. He says, Mukhayriq khayru Yahud. He's the best of the Yahudis of Medina, because he at least wanted to uplift the covenant that they created with the Prophet ﷺ. Another really quick one, the last one, in fact, I'll talk about. His name is Rashid al-Ansari al-Farisi. So his name is Rashid al-Ansari. He's from the Ansar al-Farisi, from Fars. Right? So he's from the Ansar, he's from Fars, he lived in Medina, he was a Muslim, and he goes to participate with the Prophet ﷺ in Uhud. So a guy called Ibn Uwayf shows up, and remember, they used to take pride in themselves, like, I'm Ibn Uwayf, who wants to fight, who wants to challenge me, who wants to do this, who wants to do that. And so this Ibn Uwayf goes up, and he, radiallahu anhu, Rashid al-Ansari, he goes up, and he says, خُذْهَا وَأَنَا الْغُلَامِ الْفَرِيسِ. He basically lobs his hand off, or head off, or whatever, with a sword in one movement, and he says, take it from me, and I am the ghulam from Fars, like the man from Fars, or the boy from Fars, from Persia, right? And the Prophet ﷺ hears it. And he says, isn't it better for you to say you're from the Ansar? So the brother of the man that got killed now tells him, I'm going to come and kill you for revenge against what you did to my brother. So he kills the brother, and he says, take it from me, and I'm from the Ansar. And the Prophet ﷺ said, good job. This was also one of the things that he says, so let's wrap up. So we're giving you a perspective of phase 2. Next time we'll talk about what happens now right in here with the Prophet ﷺ, because what you'll see, so we are going to move the map right in here into this area where the Prophet ﷺ effectively, the Muslims are now in disarray, this line is broken, and the mushriks pursue the Prophet ﷺ up into this mountain, and all they want to do is they want to kill him. All they want to do is they want to focus all the attack on the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ backs up into Uhud, and then we'll see the bravery of some of the companions that were with the Prophet ﷺ. That'll be the phase 3 of Uhud, inshallah. اللهم لك الحمد والشكر كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك وعظيم سلطانك. اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا وانت خير الراحمين. اللهم نسالك رضاك والجنه ونعوذ بك من سخطك والنار. اللهم انصر اخواننا في فلسطين نصرا مؤزرا يا رب العالمين. اللهم عليك باعدائهم وباعدائنا. اللهم الق الرعب في قلوبهم. اللهم زلزل الارض من تحت اقدامهم. اللهم احصهم عددا واقتلهم بددا ولا تغادر منهم احدا. واخر دعوانا ان الحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خير. See you next week.